Welcome back to our quiet corner. I'm so glad you found your way back here tonight. Here you'll find gentle stories, quietly told, to help you leave the day behind and settle into a peaceful night's sleep. Each evening, I'll share another story with you. All you need to do is make yourself comfortable and listen. Some of you have been visiting for quite some time now, while others may be here for the very first time. However you found your way here, you're always warmly welcome. If you've been enjoying these quiet evenings together, I'd be delighted if you subscribed, so our quiet corner is always easy to find whenever you need it. It means a great deal to share these quiet evenings with you. So, make yourself comfortable and we'll begin. It began, as some journeys do, long before the morning of departure. I had wanted for several years to see the bears of Alaska in autumn, not in the manner of an expedition, and certainly not as a photographer chasing a particular picture, but simply as an observer. There was something about the idea that stayed with me. Brown bears gathering along a river, while the salmon returned from the sea. The air already beginning to sharpen, the days shortening, and the whole place quietly preparing itself for winter. I think I first booked it on a gray Tuesday afternoon, which seems an oddly plain beginning for such a journey. I was at my desk with a cup of tea beside the keyboard, and the tea had gone cold while I read about the salmon run and the small aircraft that carried visitors beyond the roads. Outside, England was doing what England often does on a weekday afternoon. A little damp, a little undecided, entirely familiar. And yet, from that quiet room, I had arranged to travel to a place where rivers ran through open tundra and bears had right of way. The suitcase stood in the hallway the night before I left, zipped and ready, looking rather out of place beneath the coat hooks. I had packed warm layers, waterproof trousers, gloves, a notebook, and a book I suspected I would carry farther than I would read. Before bed, I checked the back door twice, turned the thermostat down, and set a lamp on a timer, as though the house might appreciate the company. The last thing I did was wash a single mug and fold the tea towel over the oven handle. These small domestic acts have a way of becoming more noticeable when one is about to go very far away. In the morning, the house was still and cool. There was a faint trace of last night's dinner in the kitchen, and that particular early morning silence in rooms not yet occupied. Outside, the street was dark, with the sky just beginning to lose the last of its blackness at the horizon. I pulled on my coat, lifted the bag onto my shoulder, and stood for a moment in the doorway before closing it quietly behind me. The taxi waited at the curb with its engine idling softly. The driver closed the boot with care, as people often do at that hour, not wishing to wake the neighbors. There was a low murmur from the radio in the front, and we set off through streets that seemed to belong to a different town from the one I knew by daylight. Amber street lamps shone on empty pavements. A fox paused beside a wall and watched us pass without concern. Somewhere in the distance, a milk float made its small, dutiful sound. At the airport, the world had already started its own day. There were trolleys moving over polished floors, fluorescent lights, and the smell of coffee from a kiosk that was not quite fully awake. A cleaner pushed a wide mop across the terminal in long, unhurried arcs. In the departure lounge, at an hour when most streets were still asleep, people sat beneath the bright boards and waited to be carried in different directions. A child slept across 2 seats with a coat pulled over them like a blanket. Nearby, a man ate a sandwich with great seriousness, as if it required all his attention. I have always liked that odd little pause before a long journey properly begins. One is no longer quite at home, but not yet anywhere else. I sat with a paper cup of coffee warming my hands and thought, without making too much of it, that perhaps this is one reason people travel towards wild places. Not to escape life exactly, but to be reminded that the world is larger and older than the part of it we usually move through. The flight from London to Anchorage took the northern route, curving over the top of the world in the way that looks so unlikely on the map, until one remembers the shape of the Earth. On the seatback screen, a small animated plane crept across a wide blue space. For a while, there was the ordinary business of a long-haul flight. The settling of bags, the handing out of headphones, the meal tray with its sealed corners and its small pot of yogurt, which was somehow the best part of the whole arrangement. The person beside me fell asleep almost at once, and remained that way for hours, head tilted at an angle that looked impossible to sustain. Cabin lights dimmed. Blankets appeared. The aircraft entered that suspended world of long flights, where time becomes uncertain, and everyone is lit now and then by the blue glow of a screen. A flight attendant remembered, without asking, that I took my coffee without sugar, which felt like a small kindness after so many hours in the air. Outside the window, the light behaved differently from the light at home. In late September, along that northern arc, twilight can seem to stretch for hours. The sun did not so much set as lower itself and linger. Far below, the North Atlantic gave way to cloud, and cloud gave way, now and then, to pale ice, and land too broad and empty to understand from the air. There were no fields, no neat hedgerows, no villages with church towers, only shapes of snow and stone, and later, darker land threaded with rivers that caught the light. When we crossed into Alaska, it was not announced by anything dramatic. The land below simply became vast in a different way, forested, dark, folded by water, with few signs of people. The rivers looked unhurried from that height, though of course they were doing the work rivers have always done. They moved through the land as if no one had ever thought to interrupt them. Anchorage appeared between Cook Inlet and the Chugach Mountains, a practical city set down in an immense place. The inlet was wide and gray beneath us, and the mountains rose beyond it, with snow already touching the higher ridges. Even from the air, it was clear that the city had not conquered the landscape. It had simply made room for itself there. Ted Stevens. Anchorage International Airport is, rather surprisingly, one of the busiest cargo airports in the world. That fact seemed odd at first, arriving in a place that felt so remote from London. But as we taxied past freight aircraft waiting on the apron, it began to make sense. Anchorage sits in a useful place on the globe. What feels distant from one direction is central from another. I did not linger there. Anchorage was a staging post, not the destination. Still, it made an impression. The airport was quieter than Heathrow, less hurried, with people moving purposefully, but without that tight impatience one finds in larger terminals. In the arrivals hall, there were mounted Alaskan animals, a moose, Dall sheep, and a brown bear standing upright with calm glass eyes. People passed beneath it without looking up. I stopped for a moment. It is one thing to know that a brown bear is large, and quite another to stand beside the shape of one and feel the fact become physical. Outside the terminal, the air was cold and clean after the recycled air of the cabin. It had a mineral quality to it, something between stone and ice. A sign near the hire car area warned drivers to watch for moose on the airport road, which seemed to me quietly wonderful. Not bears, moose, as though such things were simply part of traffic management. I had coffee from a small cafe while I waited for the next flight. The cup was warm in my hand, and that familiar taste was comforting in a place where the light already seemed different. It was lower, even at midday, with longer shadows and a golden cast that made ordinary objects look carefully placed. At the counter, the barista was talking with someone about a fishing trip, a river, and a dog that had apparently jumped in uninvited. I caught only fragments, but they were enough to remind me that this enormous place was also made of daily lives. The next aircraft was much smaller, a turboprop bound for King Salmon, the nearest commercial airport to Katmai National Park. The check-in desk was modest, with a single agent and a set of scales for luggage. Bags were weighed with the kind of seriousness that reminds you weight matters on a small plane. A handwritten notice made the point plainly. All bags subject to weight restrictions. No exceptions. The agent was friendly, efficient, and entirely unbothered by the fact that she worked at what felt to me like the edge of the known world. The waiting area had a few plastic chairs, a vending machine, and a window looking directly onto the tarmac. The plane outside seemed smaller than expected. Across from me, a man in muddy boots read a paperback western with complete absorption. A young woman stood near the window with a large rucksack beside her, calm and self-contained in the way of someone who had made such journeys before. Once we were in the air, the world became more immediate. The vibration of the propeller traveled through the floor and into the seat, not unpleasantly, but with a steady physical presence. The cabin smelt faintly of rubber, old upholstery, and machinery warmed by use. Through the scratched perspex window, the colors below were muted and beautiful. Rust, gold, olive, brown. The landscape was flatter now, more open. Rivers spread through wetlands in silver threads, and the road system began to fall away. Somewhere beneath us lay the great Kvichak River system, one of the most productive salmon watersheds on Earth. It was not necessary to say so aloud. The water itself seemed to explain it, branching and shining across the tundra. I thought of salmon moving upstream through those cold channels, and of bears waiting along rivers that had never had a road built beside them. There are still places, I remember thinking, where the world is entirely itself. King Salmon was small and functional, a community of only a few hundred people on the Alaska Peninsula, serving the fishing industry and the travelers who passed through on their way to Katmai. The terminal was the sort of place where everyone's bag arrived within 2 minutes, and nobody seemed surprised by anything. Outside, the land was low and open, with an enormous sky above it. Without tall buildings or many trees, the horizon felt very far away, and weather could be seen approaching from a distance. The autumn color there was close to the ground. Dwarf birch, crowberry, and Labrador tea had turned deep red, orange, and gold, so that the earth itself seemed to have changed color rather than the trees. There was a petrol station with a hand-painted sign, a pickup truck idling outside the terminal with no one in it, and a dog sitting in the back of another truck, watching arrivals with professional interest. On a notice board inside were local notices, a community meeting, a lost cat, a truck for sale. Even at the gateway to a vast national park, ordinary life continued with its usual requirements. The final leg was by float plane to Brooks Camp. A small single-engine aircraft waited at a wooden dock by the water. A de Havilland Beaver, or something very like it. The kind of plane that seems designed not for display, but for work. The pilot walked around it with quiet attention, checking things I could not name. Bags were weighed again and stowed carefully. Passengers were placed with a few words about balance. There was a seriousness to it all, but not a solemnity. This was simply how one traveled here. As I climbed in, the smell of aviation fuel mingled with cold lake air and river water. From that moment, the combination seemed to belong to Alaska. The engine started loudly enough that conversation became pointless. The world narrowed to vibration, light, and the landscape beyond the window. The aircraft lifted from the water and crossed Naknek Lake, a vast, cold expanse within the national park. Its surface blue-gray and textured by small waves that caught the low light. Katmai itself covers more than 4 million acres, larger than Northern Ireland, though it was not originally set aside because of bears. It was established in 1918 to protect the volcanic landscape left by the Nova Rupta eruption of 1912, one of the largest eruptions of the 20th century. The bears became later on the park's most celebrated residents. I thought of that as we crossed the lake. Beneath the simple fact of travel lay a far older story of fire, ash, water, and returning fish. The approach to Brooks Camp was gentle. Trees gathered along the shore. The lake opened beneath us, and then the floats touched the water with a rushing sound and a soft spray against the windows. The plane slowed, rocked slightly, and taxied towards the dock. When the engine stopped, the quiet that followed was not silence exactly. It was the sound of water against the floats, wind in the spruce, and somewhere beyond the trees, the low, steady voice of the river. The dock was weathered and damp underfoot. A member of staff waited to help with the bags, unhurried and welcoming, with the easy manner of someone who liked both their work and the place in which they did it. The first breath of air after stepping off the plane was cold and clear. It smelt of water, spruce trees, and something faintly animal. Not unpleasant, simply present. It was the smell of a place that did not belong chiefly to people. Brooks Camp was deliberately simple. A lodge, a few cabins, a visitor center, a ranger station, boardwalks, and beyond them, the river and the bear viewing platforms. The lodge was warm and wooden, unpretentious in the best possible way. It smelt of wood smoke, coffee, and damp outdoor clothing. The smell of a place that takes weather seriously. Outside the door stood a row of rubber boots in various sizes, each pair slightly muddy. Inside, a cork notice board held a hand-drawn map of recent bear sightings, marked with dots, initials, and times. A jar of pens sat nearby, with a small note asking guests to add their own. On a side table lay a dog-eared field guide to Alaskan mammals, open at the brown bear page, with a coffee ring on one corner. These details pleased me. They made the place feel less like a famous destination and more like somewhere people worked, waited, watched, and came in out of the rain. Before going anywhere else, every visitor attended the bear safety briefing. It was mandatory, and rightly so. A ranger spoke in a calm, matter-of-fact voice about giving bears space, never running, storing all food and scented items in bear-proof lockers, and yielding the trail when a bear wished to use it. The tone was not frightening. It was respectful. The message was clear enough. We were visitors in the bear's home, and we were expected to behave accordingly. Someone asked what to do if a bear appeared suddenly on the path, and the question carried more nerves than the person meant to show. The ranger answered without condescension. Stand your ground. Speak calmly. Make yourself known. Move aside when it is safe. There was something quietly humbling about hearing those instructions. In most places, people arrange the world around themselves. Here, the paths were not ours by right. The river was not ours. The adjustment was ours to make. After the briefing, I stood for a few minutes outside the lodge and listened. The Brooks River was audible from almost everywhere in camp. Not loud, but constant, like a conversation going on just out of sight. Ravens called from the spruce trees in voices that sounded almost conversational themselves. One landed on a railing a few feet away and regarded me with frank curiosity before deciding, quite reasonably, that I was of no interest. The late afternoon light came low through the trees. Spruce needles were dark green, nearly black in shadow, but golden at the tips where the sun caught them. Through the trunks, Naknek Lake lay broad and still, reflecting the sky so closely that it was hard to say where water ended and air began. A bald eagle perched in a dead spruce near the shore, large and motionless, apparently indifferent to everything below. Near the trail, in a patch of soft mud, I saw the first bear tracks. They were large, 5-toed, and unmistakable, fresh enough that the edges were still sharp. A salmon moved slowly in the shallows near the dock, dark and spent, its long journey visible in its body. It had traveled hundreds of miles to reach that place. In my own, rather gentler way, so had I. There was an electric fence around the camp perimeter, and every now and then, when I knew to listen for it, I could hear its faint, periodic tick. Boardwalks creaked softly underfoot. Somewhere, a door closed. Two people exchanged a quiet good night near the lodge, their words indistinct, but their tone easy. The float plane that had brought us lifted away across the lake, its engine growing smaller and smaller until it was gone, and the quiet it left behind felt larger than before. My cabin was basic and comfortable. A bed, a small heater, a window looking into the spruce trees, and not much else. It was everything needed, and nothing unnecessary. I unpacked slowly, hanging my coat on the single hook behind the door, setting my book, notebook, and pen on a small shelf, and placing my bag where I would not trip over it in the night. These little rituals matter in a temporary room. They make a space briefly one's own. I carried a cup of tea back from the lodge and stood by the window while the light faded. Alaska was 9 hours behind Britain at that time of year, and my body had not yet understood what it was being asked to do. But the tiredness was an honest kind of tiredness, the tiredness of distance covered. There was no phone signal, or none that I could find, and after the first small instinct to check for messages passed, the absence of it felt like a relief. The world had narrowed to the river, the trees, the fading light, and the warm cup in my hand. I sat for a short while on the edge of the bed and listened. The river went on speaking in the dark. Outside, other guests returned to their cabins, footsteps passing along the boardwalk, then slowing, then stopping. A door closed softly. The spruce trees darkened until they were shapes rather than trees, and the first stars appeared over the lake, brighter than I had expected. It seemed strange to think that same morning by the clock I had left behind, I had been standing in a familiar street with a suitcase and a taxi waiting at the curb. Now I was here, beyond the ordinary reach of roads, in a cabin among spruce trees, with a river nearby and bear tracks in the mud. Tomorrow, the watching would begin properly. Tonight, it was enough simply to have arrived. Somewhere beyond the fence, beyond the dark line of trees, a bear was perhaps moving through the night. I did not know this, of course, but it seemed likely enough. Unhurried, purposeful, entirely at home. I put the empty cup aside, turned down the small bed, and let the sound of the river remain in the room with me. Already, after only an hour or two, it had begun to feel familiar. Edward woke before the alarm, if he had truly set one at all. For a moment he lay quite still beneath the blankets, not yet ready to move, listening to the river outside. It was the first sound that reached him, steady and unhurried, as though it had been waiting patiently for him to notice it. It must have run through the whole of the night, through his sleeping and turning, and the small, unsettled dreams that come after travel. And now it was there again in the morning, unchanged. The cabin was cool around him. The heater had done enough to keep the room comfortable, but near the window the air had a clean edge to it, and there was a particular pleasure in being warm under blankets, while the morning held itself cold and still only a few feet away. The place smelt of timber, faint warmth, and the dry, simple scent of a room that contained very little it did not need. When he drew the curtain aside, the light was not the gray, softened light he knew from English mornings. It was cleaner than that, more direct, touching the tips of the spruce trees first and leaving the lower branches in shadow. Beyond them, through the gaps, the lake lay flat and silver, with a little mist still gathered over the far shore. He dressed slowly, partly because he was still waking, and partly because dressing in a small cabin requires a certain order. Socks first, then the layers, then boots laced properly rather than hopefully. His coat still held the faint smell of yesterday's journey, of aircraft cabins and lake air, and when he opened the door, the cold came in at once, sharp enough to make him smile. The boardwalk to the lodge was slightly damp with morning condensation. It gave a hollow, familiar creak beneath his boots, a sound that carried in the stillness. His breath showed briefly in front of him. A raven shifted its weight high in a spruce and looked down with the composed interest of a bird that had already seen many such mornings. The electric fence ticked quietly along the edge of camp. In daylight, it seemed less surprising than it had the evening before, but no less important. It was one of those details that told the truth about the place without making a speech of it. Humans slept here, ate here, walked here, but only by arrangement. Ahead of him, another guest moved quietly towards the lodge, and they exchanged the small nod of people awake before the day has properly begun. The river grew louder as Edward approached the building, and before he reached the door, the smell of coffee reached him, warm and certain in the cold morning air. Inside, the lodge was already awake. Overhead lights mingled with the low sun at the windows, and the room held the comfortable smell of toast, coffee, and something cooking in a pan. The tables were simple, the chairs wooden, and through the main window the lake could be seen slowly clearing itself of mist. Near the entrance, the notice board had been altered since the night before. A fresh dot had appeared on the hand-drawn map, and beside it someone had written in neat block capitals, "Bear, near river mouth, 6:15 a.m." Already the day had begun without him. He liked that. It made the place feel less like a destination and more like a world with its own habits. He took a mug of coffee and found a table with a view of the water. The first sip was strong and hot, and he held the mug in both hands for a while, letting the warmth settle into his fingers. Staff moved around the room with quiet competence. The cook was already deep into the morning's work, exchanging a few practical words with a ranger near the kitchen door. At the desk, someone checked a clipboard and spoke softly into a radio. It was not bustling exactly. It was simply functioning. A member of staff came by with the coffee pot and topped up Edward's mug without being asked. It was a small kindness, almost too small to mention. But places reveal themselves in such things. No one here seemed to be performing hospitality. They seemed at home, and because they were at home, others were made welcome. The couple at the next table had clearly been at Brooks camp for several days. They ate with the purposeful ease of people who had a plan for the morning and wanted to be outside before the light changed. They spoke of a bear by number and name, as casually as one might mention a neighbor seen at the post office. Edward had read that the bears here were identified and followed across seasons, not as pets, never that, but as individuals whose habits had become known to the rangers and to regular visitors. Across the room, a photographer ate alone while reviewing images on the back of a camera, looking up every minute or so towards the window, as though part of him remained outside. A new arrival asked careful questions at the desk, still wearing the slightly open expression of someone who had not yet gathered the place into a shape. An older couple greeted one of the staff by name and asked after a ranger who, it seemed, had moved on since their last visit. The conversation at breakfast was low and intermittent. People glanced often towards the window. When a raven landed on the railing outside and regarded the dining room with frank interest, someone gave the glass a gentle tap. The raven did not move. It had evidently formed its opinions about people long ago. Once, a slight movement near the tree line brought the whole room into a brief, shared stillness. Heads turned. Someone lifted binoculars. Then the shape resolved itself into a dark stump and a strip of shadow, and the room relaxed with a quiet ripple of laughter. Everyone here, Edward thought, had come prepared to see bears. Sometimes the eye was too eager to oblige. After breakfast, a ranger appeared at the lodge door and gathered the morning's new arrivals for the required orientation. They carried a half-finished coffee in one hand and had a radio clipped to their belt, which crackled once as the group crossed to the visitor center. The ranger listened, judged that nothing in it required them, and continued speaking as though such interruptions were simply another form of punctuation. The briefing room was plain and warm, with maps on the walls, a whiteboard, and photographs of individual bears arranged where everyone could see them. It smelt faintly of paper, coffee, and wet outer layers drying on hooks. There were perhaps 8 people in the group. Some leaned forward with the attention of first-timers. A few returning visitors sat quietly through what they already knew, and looked up whenever the ranger added something particular to the day. The ranger's manner was calm and direct, with a dry humor that made the important things easier to remember. Brown bears at Brooks Camp, they explained, were accustomed to human presence, but that did not make them tame. Habituation meant that a bear might ignore people who behaved predictably and gave it room. It did not mean the bear had become anything other than wild. They spoke of bear language as one might speak of ordinary manners. A yawn might mean stress rather than sleepiness. A bear standing on its hind legs was usually trying to see or smell more clearly, not threatening anyone. A bear lowering its head and moving with purpose should be given space. Much of the life of the river, the ranger said, was arranged without fighting. Older, larger males took the best fishing places. Younger bears and mothers with cubs worked the edges, the quieter channels, the less reliable water. Posture, patience, and presence settled most questions before conflict began. Then came the rules, delivered without drama. Stay on the boardwalks where boardwalks exist. Give bears the right of way. Do not approach them. Do not run. Keep food and scented items stored in the proper lockers. If a bear appears on a trail or boardwalk, speak calmly. Move aside if directed, and allow the animal to pass. The electric fence was reliable, the ranger added, so long as gates were closed properly, which was a gentle way of saying that reliability often depends upon human beings remembering simple things. Someone asked the question that had been sitting invisibly in the room. What should one do if a bear charged? The ranger answered without changing tone. Stand your ground. Speak firmly. Do not run. Most charges were bluffs, and a bluff charge would stop. The calmness of the answer was as useful as the answer itself. The ranger moved to the map and traced the Brooks River from Brooks Lake down to Naknek Lake. Salmon entered from the sea and worked their way through the river system towards the waters where they had begun life. In July, sockeye came in great numbers, and that was the famous crowded season at the falls. By late September, the silver salmon were moving through, Fewer bears, perhaps, but often the largest and most experienced ones, intent on feeding before winter. Brooks Falls itself lay upriver, a low drop of roughly 6 feet where the salmon had to leap to continue their journey. The geography was simple and extraordinary. A small obstacle in a short river had drawn together salmon, bears, eagles, gulls, ravens, rangers, photographers, and travelers from other countries, all because water fell over stone in just the right way. There was a word for the bear's autumn urgency: hyperphagia. The ranger said it plainly, then softened it into sense. In late summer and autumn, a bear's body begins to insist. It must eat and eat and eat again, building the fat that will carry it through denning. A large male may need several inches of fat before winter. This was not greed. It was survival, written into the body over thousands of years. As Edward listened, the thought from the day before returned to him and settled more deeply. Here, humans adapted to bears. The rules were not restrictions so much as courtesies. They were the manners of being a guest in a place that belonged, in the first instance, to something else. When the briefing ended, one guest lingered to ask whether the bear they had seen from the float plane was likely to have been coming from the river. The ranger asked where exactly the plane had crossed, then answered with genuine interest, as if no honest question about bears could ever be too small. On the notice board beside the door, Edward noticed a child's drawing pinned at an angle. A brown bear in crayon, with very round ears and enormous paws. Beneath it, someone had written, "Otis, age 6. The bear, not the artist." Outside, the morning had opened fully. The forest seemed different after the orientation. Not changed exactly, but more legible. The boardwalks ran through the spruce like careful sentences, lifting human footsteps above damp ground and keeping movement visible and predictable. The wood had weathered to a soft gray, and each stretch creaked with its own small voice. Edward walked without hurrying. The spruce forest was dense and dark. The light filtered through the canopy until it became green and diffuse. Sitka spruce and white spruce stood close together, their lower branches still and shadowed, their roots mossed over, their fallen trunks already softening back into the ground. The scent was resinous and clean, sharper than the woodlands he knew at home. At his feet, the understory held the strongest colors of autumn. Low plants had turned deep red and orange, vivid against the dark green of the trees. The forest floor, rather than the canopy, seemed to carry the season. A red squirrel scolded from somewhere close by, indignant and busy, absorbed in its own preparations for the cold. A Steller's jay moved ahead of him in blue-black flashes, curious but unwilling to admit it. Now and then, a small flock of chickadees passed through the branches with cheerful efficiency. From deeper in the trees came a single, sustained whistle that a guest with a field guide quietly identified as a varied thrush. The sound hung in the forest for a moment, and then was gone, leaving the river to resume its place as the constant voice beneath everything. Beside one stretch of boardwalk, the mud held bear tracks, large and fresh, with the claw marks printed ahead of the toe pads. A little farther on, the earth had been disturbed where something had dug. On a spruce trunk, high above Edward's shoulder, pale scratches marked the bark. The forest was quiet, but it was not empty. A ranger passed in the opposite direction, radio in hand. "Bear at the lower platform," they said quietly. "Just fishing." It was delivered with such ordinary calm that Edward nearly laughed. There are places in the world where such a sentence would alter the entire day. Here, it merely gave shape to the next half hour. The boardwalk opened, and the river appeared all at once, wider here, moving more slowly between pale gravel banks. The lower platform stood above it, with simple railings and a handful of visitors already gathered along the edge. People spoke in low voices, if they spoke at all. Some held binoculars. Some had cameras resting against their chests. Others simply watched. At first, Edward saw only water, gravel, and dark shapes that might have been stones or driftwood. Then, one of the shapes on the far bank resolved itself into a bear sitting at the water's edge. Another stood farther upstream, half in the river. A third moved slowly along the bank, with the unhurried purpose of an animal that had nowhere else it needed to be. Their size did not announce itself dramatically. It simply altered the scale of everything around them. Gravel bars became smaller. The river seemed narrower. Even at a distance, they were quietly, genuinely large. Edward found a place at the railing and settled his attention on one bear in the shallows. It was not the most active or the nearest, but it held him because it was so completely absorbed. It sat with its head lowered, watching the water. For long stretches, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the bear lunged. Water burst around its forelegs. It missed, lifted its head, and settled again, patient as stone. As he watched, the fishing methods the ranger had described began to appear in real life. One bear stood motionless, still fishing, waiting until the salmon came close enough to justify movement. Another put its whole head beneath the surface and snorkeled along the shallows in a way that was both effective and faintly comic. Farther off, a larger bear approached a smaller one that had caught a fish, and the smaller bear yielded without argument. No drama, no fight, only a quiet adjustment in the order of things. The salmon could be seen in the clear water, moving upstream in loose groups. Some were still bright, silver when they turned in the light. Others had darkened as they neared spawning, their bodies taking on the deep, worn colors of the end of the journey. They had traveled from the sea by instinct and scent, returning to the waters where they had begun. It was a fact Edward might have known in a book, but there, with the river below him and the fish moving against it, the knowledge became quieter and more exact. A sudden splash broke the surface, then another. Somewhere, a salmon jumped and fell back. Along the bank lay the spent fish that had already completed their purpose, their bodies dark and still. Bears, eagles, gulls, and ravens would take what they needed, and what remained would feed the river and then the forest. Edward remembered the ranger saying that nutrients from the ocean could be found in the growth of the spruce trees. The salmon were not only traveling inland, they were carrying the sea into the woods. Bald eagles waited in dead trees along the river, so still that Edward noticed them only when one shifted its wings. Gulls worked the shallows with noisy practicality, without a trace of dignity. A few mergansers moved through a quieter channel, diving and surfacing, as though the larger proceedings had nothing to do with them. Ravens followed the bears at a respectful distance, alert to scraps and opportunities, black eyes bright with ancient understanding. The people on the platform had their own etiquette, as definite as any rule, though no one had announced it. They moved slowly. They shared space along the rail. A man with binoculars offered them to a first-time visitor who had not quite found the bear in the distance. A photographer lowered his camera after a few minutes and simply watched. It seemed to Edward that everyone, sooner or later, surrendered the wish to capture the scene and allowed themselves to be present inside it. The bear he had chosen to watch finally caught a fish. There was a lunge, a flash of water, a brief, muscular struggle, and then the salmon was held crosswise in the bear's mouth. The bear carried it to the bank, settled down, and began to eat with complete efficiency. There was no flourish in it, no triumph. This was simply what the bear did, what it had done before, what it would do again until the season turned. At one point, the bear looked up towards the platform, not at Edward, not at any one person, but at the structure and the humans gathered upon it. The look was brief and assessing. Then the bear returned to the river. It had decided, quite reasonably, that they were not interesting. Edward found that strangely reassuring. He had traveled thousands of miles to see this animal, and the animal had no need of him at all. It did not perform. It did not acknowledge an audience. It simply stood in its own life, attentive to water, hunger, and the passing shapes of fish. Later, he walked the trail towards the upper platform at Brooks Falls, through spruce and filtered light, with the river sometimes close beside him, and sometimes hidden by the trees. The falls themselves were lower than he had imagined, and more powerful. Water folded over the drop in a firm white line, and below it the pool turned and foamed. A bear stood at the lip, waiting for the sudden silver arc of a salmon. Another worked the pool below. Younger bears watched from less certain positions, learning, perhaps, by hunger and repetition. He stayed a long while, but not because anything especially dramatic happened. That was the gift of it. The longer he watched, the more the ordinary became sufficient. A bear shifted its feet. A salmon struck the falling water and failed. A raven hopped closer to a discarded piece of fish. The river continued over the rocks. Attention, he thought, was not a reaching after something. It was a settling down. By the time he returned towards camp, the afternoon light had lowered, and the forest had darkened. His body felt pleasantly tired, not from distance, but from looking carefully for so long. The boardwalk seemed familiar now. He knew the plank that sounded different beneath his left boot. The place where the trees opened for a brief view of the lake. The turn where the smell of the lodge reached him before the building appeared. The lodge in late afternoon had a gentler atmosphere than it had at breakfast. Some guests had gone to their cabins. Others sat in the common area with mugs of tea or coffee, reviewing photographs, writing in notebooks, or speaking softly about what they had seen. The notice board had been updated again. A bear had passed near the cabins in the early afternoon, moving calmly, no incident. The note was so matter-of-fact that it almost became domestic. The older couple from breakfast told Edward about a bear they looked for each year. They described its broad face, a pale mark near one shoulder, and a habit of fishing slightly apart from the others. They had seen it that morning. Their happiness was quiet but unmistakable, and Edward understood a little more of how a place becomes personal through return. Dinner was simple and good, the kind of food that suits people who have been outside all day. There was something substantial in a large pot, bread passed along the table, and the easy, warm sound of cutlery and low conversation. The morning's restraint had softened. People told their small stories now. A bear catching 3 fish in quick succession at the falls. a cub falling asleep on the bank while its mother fished, a raven stealing scraps with such confidence that even the gulls seemed impressed, a ranger, off duty but still somehow part of the larger rhythm of the place, joined one end of the room and answered questions as they came. No lecture now, only conversation. The line between work and life seemed thin here. Not because anyone was unable to leave work behind, but because the work was bound so closely to the place they loved. Through the dining room windows, the last light touched the lake. The mountains caught pink and gold along their upper slopes, while the lower ridges had already settled into blue shadow. The sky above Naknek Lake deepened slowly, and the room grew more reflective with it, as if everyone had agreed, without speaking, to let the day quieten itself. After dinner, Edward walked once more before dark. The boardwalk held the days cold now, and the air off the lake was direct and clean. Late September gave the evening a long golden edge. The spruce trees were lit from the side, their shadows stretching across the ground, and the water reflected the mountains in darker, steadier colors than it had that morning. Somewhere out on the lake, a loon called, the sound carrying across the water in a way that seemed to belong entirely to this hour. The river was still audible behind him, running through the dusk. The salmon were invisible now, but he knew they were there. On the far bank, a dark shape moved slowly along the tree line. It might have been a bear. It was too far to say with certainty, and certainty did not seem necessary. The electric fence ticked in the quiet. The last float plane had gone. Around the camp, doors closed softly. Boots were left outside cabins. Jackets hung over railings to dry. And the whole place settled into its evening order. Back in his cabin, Edward turned on the small heater and sat for a few minutes with his notebook. He wrote only fragments. Bear looked at platform. Raven following. Spruce dark. Understory red. River smell. Mountains at dusk. It was not quite a diary. It was a way of keeping hold of what attention had gathered. The place was no longer simply new. Its rhythms had begun to make themselves known. Morning coffee, the creak of the boardwalk, the platform rail beneath his hands, the low voices of strangers looking in the same direction. The river, always present, whether seen or not. He felt the tiredness of a day spent paying attention, a genuine tiredness, earned and uncomplicated. Outside the window, darkness had gathered among the spruce. The river continued, steady and unhurried, the same sound that had entered his sleep the night before, and would, he hoped, enter it again now. The bear did not need him to have watched. The salmon did not need an audience. The river would run whether anyone listened or not. And yet there was something in being present for it. Not to possess it, not to explain it, but simply to have stood quietly at the edge of the day and noticed. Tomorrow there would be more river, more light on the mountains, perhaps more bears fishing in the shallows. The thought did not excite him exactly. It comforted him. It was the calm pleasure of being, for a little while, exactly where he was. By the third morning, Edward no longer woke with that small floating uncertainty that comes from being far from home. He did not have to remember where he was, nor listen for long before the place named itself. The river was already there beneath the window, running in its steady voice through the cold Alaskan dawn. And it seemed to Walter Ashcombe that Edward had begun to hear it not as weather, nor as background, but as a companion. It had been speaking all night, as it had spoken the night before, and the night before that. And in the darkness before waking, it had kept the cabin gently tethered to the world outside. Outside, the morning had gathered itself into mist. It lay low over Naknek Lake, thicker than on the mornings before, so that the spruce trees showed only their dark middle trunks and lower boughs, while their tops dissolved softly into gray-white air. The mountains had withdrawn entirely. The wide lake, which on clear mornings seemed to open the world, had made itself smaller and nearer, and the whole camp rested inside that quiet enclosure as though wrapped in wool. When Edward stepped out, the damp met him gently on the face. It smelled of cold water, spruce resin, wet boards, and something mineral that seemed to rise from the lake itself, old and clean and faintly stony. The boardwalk had darkened with moisture, and his footsteps came more softly than usual, as though the mist had padded the morning. Droplets beaded on every railing. They gathered along spruce needles and hung from the fine tips of grass. Between low branches, spider webs had appeared everywhere, dozens of them, round and tilted and laced with silver. Yesterday they had been invisible. Today each one was a small architecture revealed by water. The lodge was warm in a way Edward noticed more deeply because of the damp outside. Coffee scented the room, dark and steady, and from the kitchen came the buttery smell of something baking. At the notice board, a new entry had been written in the neat hand of one of the rangers. 5:47 a.m. Large mail at river mouth, with a cautious name in brackets. Otis? The question mark pleased Edward. Even here, where people knew the bears with a care that had taken years to gather, dawn and mist could make certainty soften. The older couple were already at breakfast, their hands around mugs, their faces carrying that particular wakefulness of people who had been outside before most others had opened their curtains. They had seen the bear at the river mouth. They thought it was Otis. It was the way he moved, they said, that slow rolling gait, and the slight favoring of one foreleg. Not enough to trouble him, only enough to be known by those who had watched him season after season. Edward listened with a quiet envy that had no bitterness in it. There were kinds of knowledge that could not be hurried. They had to be earned by returning. A new guest sat near the window, having arrived by float plane the evening before. Their gaze kept moving from the room to the lake and back again, as if everything were still too new to be believed. Edward recognized the expression. Only a few mornings earlier, he had worn it himself. Now he felt the small, private pleasure of belonging just enough to understand what the newcomer did not yet know. Where the coffee was poured, which window looked toward the river mouth, how the camp settled after breakfast, and how the day seemed to arrange itself around the patient possibility of bears. The cook came out briefly, wiping flour from one hand with the other, and stood without speaking at the lodge window. For a few moments she looked at the mist lying over the lake. Her face did not change much, but something in the stillness of her posture told Edward that she was not checking the weather. She was simply looking. Then she turned back to the kitchen, and the morning continued. Later, at the lower platform, the mist made the river feel closer. The far bank was only a suggestion, spruce and gravel blurring in pale air. And the bears appeared not so much by arriving as by becoming visible. A dark shape would gather itself from the gray, then resolve into shoulders, head, wet fur, the slow, deliberate placement of a paw in shallow water. The sound of the river seemed clearer than it had on brighter days. A salmon splashed. Moisture dripped from the railing. Somewhere near the bank, a bear moved through water with a soft, heavy sound. And all of it felt less like spectacle than like being allowed to sit quietly inside a dream. The ranger from Edward's first orientation came along the platform in mid-morning, when the mist had begun to thin and the river had started showing more of itself. Only a few visitors were there, each spaced along the rail, and the quiet made conversation feel natural. A bear was fishing in the middle distance, steady and unhurried, and the ranger rested both hands on the damp wood beside Edward, as though they had met there by arrangement. They spoke softly, not wishing to disturb the morning. The ranger had come to Brooks Camp for a summer contract several seasons ago, and had found it difficult to leave. This happened more often than people expected, they said. The park held on to certain people. It did not do so loudly. It simply entered their habits, their calendars, their idea of what a year should contain, until returning seemed less like a decision than a form of keeping faith. The ranger talked about the bears as individuals, never as curiosities. Each one carried a history, pieced together through summer after summer of patient watching. A mother remembered by her cubs, a young male recognized after his first independent season, an old injury healed into a way of walking. There was a large female, the ranger said, who had lost a cub 3 seasons before and had not had cubs since. The words were offered plainly, without drama, yet not without feeling. In this place, tenderness seemed to take the form of accuracy. Edward asked, after a while, why some bears seemed so much better at fishing than others. The ranger smiled a little, as if pleased by the question. Size mattered, of course, and strength, and position in the hierarchy, but much of it was experience. Bears learned by watching their mothers, then by failing, and failing again, and slowly discovering what the water meant. A young bear might spend its first seasons at the falls lunging at the wrong flashes, copying the older bears at the wrong moment, or standing where the current gave it nothing. The learning was visible, the ranger said, if one watched long enough. They watched the bear in the water miss one salmon, then another, then settle again into stillness. Some bears were bold, the ranger said. Some were cautious. Some seemed curious about everything, and others cared only for the river. There was a young male who had taken to fishing in an unfashionable place away from the main gathering, catching fewer fish but avoiding the pressure of the larger bears. The ranger found him especially interesting. Not clever in the human sense, perhaps, but particular. Himself. The talk drifted, as river talk does, toward the season's end. After the camp closed, the bears would disperse into the back country. Some would den in October, others later if the weather stayed mild and food remained worth seeking. The staff would leave. The platforms would empty. Snow would cover the boardwalks. The river would run dark beneath ice at its edges. And the ravens would remain. The ranger had once stayed long enough to see the first snowfall before final closure, and described the place then as almost beyond words. The camp quiet, the roofs white, the river still speaking, and no one there to ask anything of it. Edward thought about that as the mist lifted from the far bank. The ranger knew this place in a way he could not in 3 days, not in a single season. To know a place well was not only to recognize what was present, it was to notice what had changed. A bear not where it usually stood, a salmon run slightly thinner, snow lower on the mountains than it had been the morning before. Perhaps, with time, Edward might learn to see 1 or 2 such things. For now, he was content to learn that there were things he did not yet see. By the time he set out for Brooks Falls, the mist had lifted enough for the forest to invite him in. The trail followed the river for about a mile, sometimes on gravel, sometimes on raised boardwalk where the ground softened beneath moss and roots. Signs reminded walkers that bears used the trail too. Make noise, be aware. Edward obeyed in the slightly self-conscious manner of a solitary man clapping once or twice into spruce shadows, then smiling at himself because the instruction was both faintly absurd and entirely reasonable. The forest beyond camp was older and denser. Spruce trunks rose thickly, some broad enough that Edward paused beside them and laid a hand briefly against the furrowed bark. Their lower branches were dead and broken, silver gray against the dark, while higher up, the living needles held what remained of the morning damp. Devil's Club filled the understory, its broad leaves yellowing toward autumn, its spined stems beautiful from a respectful distance. Bears moved through such growth as though it were no barrier at all. Humans, Edward thought, were better suited to paths. The river stayed with him, sometimes hidden, sometimes visible through breaks in the trees. At one bend, the trail came close to the bank, and Edward stood watching a pool where salmon held themselves facing upstream. Their fins worked gently, almost invisibly, against the current. The bright silver of their ocean bodies had darkened into red-brown and bronze, and some carried torn fins or scarred flanks from the long passage inland. They rested without knowing the words for rest, then continued, because continuing was what they had come to do. Signs or bears appeared along the way. Fresh tracks pressed into a muddy patch. A dark pile of scat showed salmon bones and berry seeds. On a low bank, the vegetation was flattened, and the mud churned, as if a heavy body had fished there that morning and then gone on. The smell of the trail shifted with the wind. Spruce resin, wet earth, river water, and now and then the faint organic scent of salmon. It was not unpleasant. It was simply part of the place, as honest as wood smoke or rain. He stopped once and stood very still, the river ran beside him. Wind moved softly in the upper branches. A woodpecker drummed somewhere deeper in the forest, quick and mechanical. And a raven called ahead with that rough, knowing voice ravens have. The world went on without requiring him. Its indifference was not cold. It was spacious. It gave him permission to be only one listening creature among many. Near the water's edge, a mink flickered into view, dark brown and low to the stones, moving with a quick, liquid purpose before vanishing again. Farther on, a small gray-brown bird bobbed on a rock in the current. It dipped and dipped, then dropped beneath the surface and disappeared, reappearing several feet downstream, as though the river had quietly returned it. Two bald eagles watched from a dead spruce above the water. One fell from its branch with hardly a sound, swept low, and rose again with a salmon gripped in its talons. The movement was so clean and brief that the forest seemed to close over it at once. The sound of Brooks Falls arrived before the sight of them. It was deeper than the river's usual voice, a broad, continuous rushing that filled the trees ahead. Then the trail opened, and Edward stepped onto the upper platform. The falls lay below him, a low white drop across the river, the water folding over the lip and churning into a dark pool filled with salmon. Bears stood at different levels of the river, some at the brink, some in the foaming water below, some on the bank, waiting with the patience of animals who knew the day would provide. The salmon leapt again and again. Most did not make it. They rose silver-red from the pool, struck the white face of the falls, and were swept back into the churning water. A few found the exact line, hung for the briefest instant in air, and vanished over the top into the river beyond. One bear stood at the lip with his head low. He did not move for many fish. Then, when one came as if into the place he had been watching all along, he lunged with sudden precision. The salmon was in his jaws before the eye had fully understood the motion, and the whole platform seemed to become still in respect for such practiced timing. The falls platform had its own quiet community. People had been there for hours, settled into places along the railing, speaking only when useful. The solo photographer from the lodge stood with a tripod and a patient expression, already familiar with the bears present and their habits for the day. Without ceremony, the photographer told Edward which bear held the prime place at the lip, which young female was working the pool below, and where the mother with cubs had been keeping to the far bank. It was not showing off. It was the generosity of one watcher making room for another. A family stood nearby, two older children leaning forward with contained delight, asking questions in whispers and trying to notice things before their parents did. At the far end of the rail, an older man wrote steadily in a small notebook, looking up, writing again, and then looking up once more. Edward and the man exchanged a nod. They were doing the same thing in different ways, keeping what they could, knowing that most of it would remain uncapturable. The large male at the lip of the falls seemed to contain the whole calm authority of the river. Other bears gave him space without any visible request. He stood with water moving around his legs, head lowered, eyes fixed on the place where salmon rose. His stillness was not laziness. It was knowledge. He let fish pass, one after another, as though he had all the time in the world, and then, without warning, chose. When he carried a salmon to the bank, he ate only the richest parts, the head, the skin, the eggs, and left the rest. Ravens came within seconds, black and bright-eyed, and he did not trouble himself to notice them. His size was plain at that distance. His head was as large as a dog. His paws, when he lifted one and set it down again, seemed broader than a dinner plate. Yet there was nothing exaggerated in him. He was not grand because anyone watched him. He was grand because he fitted his life exactly. He had stood in that water many times. He knew what the current did, where the fish tired, how near another bear might come before it mattered. He was simply there, doing what he had learned to do in the place that had taught him. Below him, a young female worked harder in the turbulent pool. She lunged often and missed often, her whole body entering each attempt. When she caught a fish, she ate quickly and completely. She glanced from time to time toward the male above her. He did not look back. The hierarchy lay in that imbalance of attention as clearly as if it had been spoken. Once she carried a large salmon to the bank, and a raven landed near her. It edged closer, foot by foot. She made a brief, sharp movement toward it, not with anger, simply with reminder. The raven hopped back, waited, and moved in only when she had finished. On the far bank, away from the densest gathering, a mother bear fished in the shallows with two cubs of the year nearby. They were round and dark and still faintly puppyish in the face, large enough to seem sturdy and small enough to make every movement endearing. Their mother caught fish and allowed them to take some, not always, but often enough. The cubs tried to fish too. They lunged at ripples, shadows, and places where salmon had been a moment before. Once one of them snapped at the water and came up with something small and silver, and its surprise seemed visible even from the platform. A quiet smile passed along the railing. The mother's vigilance never rested. She fished, watched the water, watched the bank, watched the cubs, and watched the other bears. When a larger bear moved in her direction, even at a distance and without apparent intent, she placed herself between it and the cubs. The movement was subtle, but complete. Later, while she fished again, the cubs sat together on the bank, leaning shoulder to shoulder, observing the river, the ravens, and the mother's broad back. One batted at a raven that came too near. The raven sidestepped, unimpressed, as though it had been dealing with bear cubs for centuries. A subadult male watched from the bank above the pool, not yet strong enough to claim a favored place. He sat with his attention moving from the large male at the lip to the young female below, studying both with a patient, contained energy. Now and then he stepped toward the water, paused, and retreated. Not yet, his body seemed to say. Not quite yet. Edward found him particularly compelling. This bear stood at the beginning of a long education. If he lived and learned, he would grow into the river. One day, he might stand where the old male stood now, while some younger bear watched from the bank and considered the future, without knowing it was doing so. By mid-afternoon, the light changed. The water at the falls took on brightness along its broken surfaces, and spray made brief, partial rainbows that appeared and vanished whenever the wind shifted. The great male's fur, wet and sunlit, showed deep brown beneath and golden tips where the light caught it. The falls filled Edward's ears until, after a while, he noticed he had not thought of anything beyond what was before him. The sound had occupied the mind gently and left it clear. It became plain to him then, not as an idea, but as a settled feeling, that the bears were not performing. They were not arranging themselves for the platform, not offering lessons, not asking to be admired. All the watching belonged to the human side. The bears were only living, feeding, learning, yielding, guarding, resting, continuing. There was something deeply restful in that. The world did not need Edward's attention in order to go on. He was not necessary to it. And yet, he had been allowed to witness it. For that afternoon, witnessing was enough. Later, after he had walked back through the forest, and the sound of the falls had slowly given way to the familiar voice of the river, Edward spent a quiet hour inside the visitor center. Rain had begun to tap lightly at the windows. The room held maps, photographs, and the calm, museum-like stillness of a place where time had been arranged for looking. There he read again about the eruption of Novarupta in June 1912, when the greatest volcanic eruption of the 20th century began beneath a clear Alaskan sky and continued for 60 hours. Ash darkened the region and traveled astonishing distances. Pyroclastic flows filled what had been a river valley, in places hundreds of feet deep. And as the hot ash cooled, it breathed steam through thousands of vents. When Robert Griggs reached it in 1916, the valley seemed full of smoke, rising from the ground in silence. The name remained, the Valley of 10,000 Smokes. Edward looked at an old photograph of that valley, gray and immense and almost lunar, and beside it a recent image where the land still looked bare, but no longer newly wounded. There was a map of ashfall spreading across distances that seemed too large for one event. There were notes about Katmai village, abandoned after the eruption and never reoccupied, and about the slow return of salmon, bears, ravens, spruce, and low vegetation at the edges of the changed land. The peaceful river he had walked beside belonged to a landscape made, in part, by catastrophe. And yet, what remained with him was not violence, but resilience. Given time and room, the land had found its way back. Not quickly, not neatly, and not for anyone's reassurance, but steadily. The salmon had returned to the rivers. The bears had followed the salmon. The forest had begun again where it could. Edward stood before the photographs for a long while, hearing rain on the roof and the river beyond the building, and felt the day deepen around him. The bears at the falls were not only part of a season, they were part of a recovery still continuing. When he stepped outside, the lake seemed enormous after the enclosed room. The rain had passed, and the wind had lifted small waves across Naknek Lake, each one folding gently onto the dark volcanic sand and gravel. Edward walked along the shore until he found a pale piece of driftwood and sat there with nowhere to be. The water was not blue exactly, but gray-green and clear-looking, with a cold depth that made it seem very old. Behind him, somewhere beyond the camp and trees, the river still carried salmon, and the bears were still fishing. The shore offered smaller things. Feathers lay among the stones. Raven, gull, perhaps eagle. A strip of dried salmon skin, translucent and curled, had been left by bear or bird. At the water's edge, a single bear track filled with lake water, its edges already softening. Far out, a common loon surfaced and dove, again, and once gave a call that traveled over the lake with an ancient, wavering loneliness that was not sad so much as deep. Near the river mouth, an otter appeared briefly, rolling in the water, catching a small fish and eating it afloat, as though the lake itself were a table. Small sandpipers moved along the waterline in a tight group, picking with quick precision, then lifting all at once and wheeling low over the shore before settling again a little farther on. At the forest edge, Edward found a moose track pressed deeply into soft ground, large and split, with the dew claws showing. He had not seen a moose, and perhaps would not. But the track widened the place in his mind. The platforms showed one part of the living world. The rest continued beyond them, hidden in willow, spruce, muskeg, and hillside. Late September light lay low over everything. The spruce shadows reached long across the boardwalks, and beyond the camp, the tundra plants burned in quiet colors, red, orange, gold, so vivid that the land seemed warmed from within. On the northern mountains, snow had crept lower overnight. Winter was not yet here, but it had placed a hand on the high slopes. The bears knew this in their bodies. The salmon knew it in the river. The whole landscape was gathering itself toward the long, dark season. The older couple were sitting on another piece of driftwood farther along the shore, looking out over the lake without speaking. They waved Edward over, and he sat with them in the comfortable silence of people who did not feel obliged to fill the air. After a while, they spoke of their first visit, years before, when the camp had been rougher, the boardwalks fewer, and the management of visitors less polished. Once, they said, a bear had walked straight through the middle of camp. Everyone had gone still. The ranger on duty had simply waited, and the bear had passed the lodge, past the cabins, and gone into the forest as if following an old private road. They spoke of bears they had watched grow old, of cubs that had become mothers, of young males that had risen slowly through the hierarchy, and of others that had disappeared from the river and were remembered only by those who had known their numbers, their scars, their favorite fishing places. One bear they had followed for 12 years. They knew its mother, its siblings, its seasons of success and absence. They did not speak of it as a pet or a friend. Their affection was quieter and more honest than that. It was the affection one might feel for a wild life, allowed to remain wild. "The bears don't need us to come back," one of them said at last, watching the lake. "But we need to come back to them." Edward carried the sentence carefully. Their returning was not sentimental. It was a kind of devotion made of attention, respect, and the willingness to be changed a little each time. His own relationship with the place was only a few days old, but already it felt real. Already he knew he would carry it home. Already, without quite admitting it, he understood that he would want to return. As the light faded, Edward walked back toward camp. The boardwalk had become familiar in its details. The plank that creaked, the slight bend where spruce branches leaned close, the gap through which the lake appeared for 2 or 3 steps before vanishing again. The smell of the lodge reached him before the building did, warm and savory, and the windows glowed against the darkening forest. Guests were returning from platforms and trails with the easy tiredness of people who had spent the day paying attention. In the lodge, the notice board had filled with the day's sightings. Times, places, bear numbers, brief notes in tidy writing. It was an ordinary record, and an extraordinary one. The solo photographer sat with a laptop open, and when Edward passed, turned the screen to show him the large male at the falls in the instant of catching a salmon. Water burst around the bear's head. The fish was visible in his jaws. The image was remarkable, but the photographer looked at it with thoughtful calm, already considering what tomorrow's light might offer. Dinner gathered the temporary community of Brooks Camp around its tables. The new arrival from breakfast looked less dazed now, already beginning to find their footing. The family's children spoke in eager whispers about the bears at the falls. The ranger, off duty, ate with the group and answered questions with the same unhurried care they had shown on the platform. The forecast promised more mist in the morning, clearing later. Someone asked when the bears would den, and the ranger said there was no fixed schedule. October for some, November for others. Weather mattered, food mattered, and each bear made its own decision. They spoke, too, of the salmon. The silver run would continue for a few more weeks, though numbers would thin. The fish that made it beyond the bears would reach the spawning beds, lay and fertilize eggs, and then die in the river. Their bodies would feed insects, plants, water, and, in time, the next generation of salmon. The river was fed by the very lives that traveled through it. After this was said, the table grew quiet for a moment. No one made it solemn. It was solemn enough by itself. After dinner, Edward stepped back onto the boardwalk. The mist of morning had gone completely, and the night was clear. Stars were beginning to gather above the lake, more of them than he expected, and the Milky Way showed faintly as a pale scatter across the dark. The lake itself was black, the mountains invisible but present. From the riverbank came the slow movement of a bear, only a dark shape in the last of the light, walking without hurry along the near shore toward the trees. Edward watched until it was gone, then stayed a little longer, listening. Back in the cabin, the heater gave off a low warmth, and the window reflected only darkness. The river came through the glass, softened but constant. Edward opened his notebook and found more to write than the night before. Spider webs revealed by mist, the ranger's winter story, salmon holding in the pool, the dipper vanishing underwater, the subadult male watching from the bank, the old couple on the driftwood, the photograph on the laptop screen, the bear disappearing into evening. The tiredness in him was deeper than before, but gentle. His body had settled into the place. The time difference had loosened its hold. He had spent an entire day in one landscape, moving slowly, watching closely, and allowing each small thing to lead to the next. It seemed to Walter that the middle days of a stay somewhere remarkable are often the ones most clearly kept. Not arrival, with all its brightness and adjustment. Not departure, with its awareness of ending. The middle days, when the place has become real, and leaving has not yet begun. Out in the dark, the bears were somewhere beyond the cabin walls, moving through the forest, sleeping on a hillside, or perhaps still standing near the river's edge. They did not know that Edward lay awake thinking of them, and they did not need to know. They were continuing, as the salmon continued, as the ravens continued, as the river continued through the long, cold night. The stars remained above Naknek Lake. The mountains stood unseen in the darkness. The vast, ancient, indifferent, beautiful world went about its business. And Edward, warm in his cabin, listened as the river carried him little by little toward sleep. Edward woke before the camp was properly awake, and for a little while he did not move. The room around him was still dim, though the edges of the window had begun to gather the first clear color of morning. And beyond the glass, the river was already speaking in its steady, familiar voice. It had been there every morning of his stay, running through sleep and waking alike. But on this last morning, he listened to it with a care he had not quite given it before. The sound seemed fuller now, not louder, only more known. Water moving over gravel, water folding around stones, water traveling its short, cold way from Brooks Lake towards Naknek Lake, carrying the season with it. He knew, without needing to remind himself, that this was his last full morning at Brooks Camp. The knowledge did not arrive as sadness exactly. It was gentler than that, and clearer. It made each ordinary thing appear with a quiet brightness. The coat hanging from its peg, the boots beside the door, the small shelf where his notebook lay thicker now than it had been when he arrived. He looked around the cabin as though it had become, for a few brief days, a small domestic country of its own. He had lived here lightly, temporarily, and yet it had held him well. The walls had kept the night air out. The window had given him the river. The floorboards had taken the careful weight of his early morning steps. He dressed slowly, because there was no useful hurry in this place, and because the camp had taught him that unhurried was not the same as idle. He pulled on warm layers, tied his boots, and stood for a moment with his hand resting on the back of the chair. Outside, the sky above the spruce trees was a deep, cold blue, clearer than the morning before, a morning that seemed not to assemble itself gradually from mist and shadow, but simply to be there, complete from the beginning. When he stepped out onto the boardwalk, the cold met him at once. His breath showed pale in the air, and the wooden railing was sharp and clean beneath his fingers. A thin rime of frost lay on the level places, along the rail, across the boards, on the broad leaves of bunchberry under the spruce. It was the first frost of his visit, and it seemed less like an event than a message quietly delivered. The season had moved another step while he slept. The bears would know it in their bodies. The salmon would know it in the water. The spruce, in their patient, evergreen way, would know it too. The camp was hushed. The lodge was not yet fully open, and the boardwalk ahead of him was empty. He walked towards the lake, listening to the soft creak of each plank beneath his boots. The smell of spruce was clean and resinous in the cold. Somewhere, before any human voice had entered the day, a raven called from the trees. Its call traveled out over the lake and came back a moment later from the far shore, thinner and more distant, as though the morning itself had answered. The lake was completely still. It held the mountains so clearly that the reflected ridges seemed as real as the ridges themselves. And for a while, the boundary between water and sky disappeared. The float plane dock, the dark spruce, the pale slope of distant rock and snow, all of it existed twice, one world above and one beneath, joined by stillness. Edward stood at the shore, without thinking of taking out his notebook. Some things were not improved by being written down too soon. They needed first to be looked at and allowed. Near the beach, he saw a bear track pressed into the frost. The edges were sharp, and the frost inside the print had been disturbed only slightly. It had been made recently, perhaps within the last hour, by a bear already gone about its mourning. The day had begun without him, as every day here had begun without him. That thought brought him a strange comfort. The camp, the river, the bears, the salmon, the ravens in the spruce, all had been moving in their own rhythm before he arrived, and would continue when he left. The world did not require his witness. But witnessing it had changed the quality of his attention, and that was no small thing. By the time he turned back towards the lodge, the smell of coffee had begun to drift into the cold air. A door opened somewhere behind him, then closed softly. The camp was entering its ordinary morning, and Edward followed the warmth inside. The lodge felt familiar in every detail now. The scrape of chair legs on the floor, the faint clatter from the kitchen, the warm smell of coffee, and something simple from the griddle. The notice board near the entrance, which he had glanced at many times, held a week's worth of bear sightings, in dots, initials, times, and brief comments. This morning, he stopped and read it properly, from the first entry to the last. There were sightings of bears he had come to recognize, and others that had only passed through the record as numbers and brief notes. Different hands had written there. Rangers, guests, perhaps someone leaving a quick mark before heading back out into the day. It was not just a list. It was a collective act of attention. Through the serving hatch, the cook moved with the same calm efficiency Edward had seen each morning. Only now did he realize he had never learned the cook's name, and the realization brought a small, mild regret, the sort that belongs to departures. There are always people who help make a place feel held together, and sometimes one notices them most clearly only when leaving. The older couple were already at their table with their coffee. They knew he was leaving that day, and greeted him with warmth, but without fuss, as though they understood that too much ceremony would make the leaving heavier than it needed to be. Before he rose from their table, the woman slid a small folded piece of paper across to him. On it was written the number of the bear they had been watching for 12 years. "In case you come back," she said, "you'll want to know which one to look for." Edward held the paper carefully, as though it were something more fragile than paper. The gift lay not in the number alone, but in the assumption tucked inside it, that he might return, that the bear might still be there, that a human life could make a quiet thread of continuity with a wild one, by coming back and paying attention. At a corner table, the solo photographer was packing equipment into neat black cases. Lenses disappeared into padded compartments. Straps were folded. Memory cards were checked and tucked away. The photographer looked up long enough to say, "The light this morning is extraordinary. I almost wish I wasn't leaving." Then, with a small smile that needed no further explanation, they returned to the practical business of departure. The ranger came by his table while he was finishing breakfast, clipboard tucked under one arm, already partly turned towards the day's work. "What will you take away from it?" the ranger asked. Edward considered the question properly. He said that the bears had become less frightening and more ordinary than he expected, and that their ordinariness had been the most extraordinary part. The ranger nodded, not surprised. "That's what most people say," they replied. Eventually. The new arrival from a few days before moved through the room now with an ease Edward recognized. They were staying another 3 days, and there was a brightness about them, the look of someone who had just found their footing and had time ahead. Edward remembered wearing that same look himself when he first noticed the older couple settled into the place with the deep comfort of long familiarity. He took his final cup of coffee to the window table, the one he had chosen each morning for its view of the lake. Outside, the water remained mirror flat. The mountains doubled beneath the enormous sky. A bald eagle crossed low over the surface, and for a brief while there were 2 eagles, one moving through the air and one moving beneath it in the lake. The real bird landed in a dead spruce near the shore. The reflected one broke apart into ripples. The coffee was the same coffee as every morning, but it seemed to carry more warmth in his hands. He did not open his notebook. He did not return to the notice board. He did not try to fix the moment into words. He sat and looked at the lake, and listened for the river beneath the quiet sounds of breakfast, and let himself be there for a few more minutes, without asking anything of the place. After breakfast, he had 2 hours before the float plane was due. It was not enough time to walk all the way to the falls platform and back without making the morning feel hurried. So he chose the lower platform and the river bank near camp, the places that had become familiar through repetition. The boardwalk led him naturally towards the water, past spruce trunks and pale grasses, past the places where he had learned to pause and look before moving on. The lower platform stood in clean sidelight. The sun was low enough to touch every ripple, and the river seemed made of small, moving pieces of brightness. The gravel bars were pale and clear, the far bank dark with spruce. 2 bears were visible at first. Then a third shape resolved itself farther upstream. The young female was in the shallows, recognizable now by her size, her chosen stretch of water, and her energetic, slightly haphazard way of fishing. She lunged, missed, shook water from her head, and tried again with a determination that seemed entirely her own. She had not changed since the first time he watched her. Edward had. On the far bank, the mother bear moved with her cubs close beside her. The cubs seemed larger than when he first saw them, though perhaps he was simply better at seeing now. One of them tried to fish independently, lunging at the water with more confidence than accuracy. It missed, tried again, missed again, then sat down in the shallows and stared at the moving surface, as if the river had offered a puzzle it was not yet old enough to solve. The mother watched without intervening. Her stillness was not indifference. It was a kind of trust, measured and attentive. The large male was not there that morning. His absence was noticeable, not because the river lacked anything, but because Edward had come to expect him, as one expects a mountain or a particular bend in a path. Perhaps he was at the falls, or resting somewhere in the trees, or simply elsewhere for reasons known only to himself. The thought was useful. The bears were not fixed features arranged for human watching. They had their own movements, their own hunger, their own private negotiations with the day. The sub-adult male was on the bank above the pool, in his usual watching place. He remained almost motionless, head lifted, eyes following the water and the older bears below. Edward watched him for a long time. There was something restful in that patience, the willingness to observe before acting, to learn by staying still, to wait for the moment when movement would matter. On this last morning, it seemed a lesson as much as a behavior. After a while, Edward left the platform and walked to the permitted stretch of riverbank near camp. He sat on a weathered log at the water's edge. From this lower angle, the river was not something viewed from above, but something present beside him. The current moved past his boots, clear and cold, revealing each stone on the gravel bed. A dark salmon held in the water a few feet away, barely moving, its body red-brown and worn, its fins frayed, its eyes clouded with the final effort of return. A raven landed on a rock in midstream. It looked at Edward with frank attention, picked at a small remnant of fish, then looked again, as though weighing him, and finding him neither useful nor troubling. After a moment, it lifted its wings and flew upstream, following the river's line. The salmon near Edward's feet continued to hold its place in the current. It had traveled from the ocean, found its way by scent and instinct, crossed distance and difficulty, laid its eggs in the water that had first held it, and now it was finishing. There was no need to call it sorrowful. It was completion. Nothing was wasted here. The body of the salmon would feed the river, the ravens, the bears, the small hidden life of the bank. Ocean nutrients, carried inland in muscle and bone, would find their way into soil and root and spruce ring. Everything became something else in time. Edward sat very still and let that thought settle without trying to make it larger than it was. He, too, was completing something, though it was a smaller, human thing. He had come to witness. He had witnessed. He would carry it home. Before he left the bank, he crouched and put one hand into the brook's river. The cold was immediate and absolute, a clean cold that seemed to pass through skin and thought alike. The current pulled gently at his fingers. Beneath the water, each pebble held its own shape and color. He kept his hand there for a moment, then withdrew it, stood, and looked once more along the river's course. It did not acknowledge him. It simply continued, running from Brooks Lake to Naknek Lake, carrying salmon, cold, shadow, and autumn light. Then, from across the lake, came the faint approach of an engine. The float plane was on its way. Edward turned back towards camp, with the sound of the river following him through the trees. The departure had its own calm routine. Bags were brought towards the dock. The pilot moved around the aircraft with methodical care, checking floats, struts, doors, and fuel with the same quiet attentiveness that had marked the arrival. Edward's bag was mostly packed already. The last things had gone in that morning. His notebook, the folded paper with the bear's number, and the small odds and ends that somehow make a room feel inhabited until the moment they are removed. He emptied the bear-proof locker and left it open, as instructed. The rule felt, by now, less like restriction than respect. In the cabin, he left the key on the shelf and turned the heater off. Before closing the door, he opened the window for a final moment and let the river enter the room without glass between them. The sound filled the small space so naturally that it seemed the cabin had been waiting to receive it. Then he closed the window, picked up his bag, and stepped out. The older couple came down to the dock, though they were not leaving. They had another week ahead of them, and perhaps that was why their farewell was so easy. The man's handshake was firm and warm. The woman's smile was unhurried. "Come back," she said. It was not a pleasantry. It sounded like a practical instruction, kindly given. The ranger paused on the boardwalk, radio at the shoulder, clipboard in hand, already being called back into the ongoing work of the park. "I hope it was what you were looking for," they said. Edward answered that it had been more than that. The ranger nodded, as though this too was part of the pattern, and went on towards the day's duties. Through the kitchen window of the lodge, the cook was busy as always. Edward lifted a hand. The cook lifted a spatula in return. It was enough. He walked the boardwalk one last time. The same familiar plank creaked beneath his step. The same opening in the trees showed the lake. The electric fence ticked softly. The spruce gave off its cold green scent. The river, unseen now, still followed him all the way to the dock. The float plane rested on the mirror of the lake, its floats making only the smallest disturbance in the reflection. The solo photographer's cases were stacked neatly, and a few other departing passengers stood quietly nearby. They all had the subdued manner of people leaving a place they had not wanted to leave. The ravens called from the spruce. Far off, carried by the still air, there may have been the faint sound of the falls, or perhaps Edward only imagined it because he knew it was there. Boarding happened in the same careful order as arrival, only reversed. Bags were stowed, seats were taken. The pilot gave brief safety words, and then the engine started, loud and immediate, filling the morning. The plane taxied away from the dock. Through the scratched window, Edward saw the lodge, the boardwalk, the spruce trees, and the dark mouth of the Brooks River, where it entered the lake. Dark water meeting dark water, with hardly a line between them. The aircraft gathered speed across the lake. Water rushed past the floats, and then the whole world loosened beneath them. The camp became small. The river appeared from above as a dark thread through the spruce forest, running between the two lakes. The falls were no more than a pale line across it. If bears stood there, they were too small to see. Naknek Lake spread below, vast and gray-blue, holding mountains and sky on its surface. Brooks Camp, already difficult to distinguish from the trees, seemed to be returning to the landscape even as he watched. From that height, the human presence was very small. A lodge, a few cabins, boardwalks, platforms, a dock. It did not seem diminished by its smallness. It seemed clarified. The camp existed by choosing not to overwhelm the place that held it. It was a way of visiting without possession, of watching without claiming, of being present in a wild country while leaving its wildness intact. The wilderness opened in every direction. Then the camp slipped behind the tree line, and the lake widened beneath the plain. The float plane landed at King Salmon on the Naknek River, returning Edward to the same dock, the same smell of cold water and aviation fuel, the same wide sky over the flat tundra. Yet King Salmon felt different now. On the way out, it had been a threshold to something unknown. On the way back, it was a place he recognized, lightly but genuinely, because he had passed through it once already and returned with the river still in him. The tundra colors seemed deeper than before. Dwarf birch redder, crowberry darker, grasses more gold than green. The season had advanced while he had been watching bears. In the small airport terminal, the plastic chairs and vending machine were unchanged. But one notice on the board had been amended. The lost cat had been found. A small handwritten update had been pinned over the old message, and Edward found the ordinariness of it unexpectedly moving. Life here had continued in all its small particulars. Waiting for the onward flight had a different quality from waiting on the outward journey. Then his mind had leaned forward. Now it leaned back. The same sort of chair held him. The same kind of announcement sounded overhead. A man in muddy boots read a paperback nearby. It was not the same man as before, but he seemed to belong to the same long, quiet procession of people passing through this place on their way to and from rivers, camps, work sites, cabins, hunting grounds, and homes. The turboprop to anchorage vibrated through the seat in a way that felt familiar now. From the window, the land below was the same wide composition of tundra, braided rivers, wetlands, and dark forest. But Edward no longer saw it as empty. He knew what might be moving along those banks, what might be feeding beneath the spruce, what dark shapes might be resting in the current. The landscape had become inhabited in his imagination by everything he had been given time to see. Roads appeared gradually, first a single line, then another, and then the grid of anchorage came into view. The city lay in its bowl between mountains and inlet, ordinary and astonishing at once. The snow had come lower on the slopes since he last saw them. The season was moving everywhere, not only at Brooks Camp. At Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, he stopped again before the mounted brown bear in the arrivals hall. On the way out, it had seemed enormous enough to prepare him. Now he saw that it was accurate and insufficient. The proportions were right. The fur and size were convincing. But the stillness was wrong. It could not hold the patience of a bear choosing a fishing place, the subtle authority of a mother shifting her body between cubs and another bear, the selectivity of a large male at the falls, or the small individuality that careful watching had revealed. It was a bear. The bears at the river had been themselves. He bought coffee at a small airport cafe and held the warm cup between both hands. The terminal lights were bright, the voices around him layered and restless, and somewhere behind him wheels clicked over polished floor. The coffee might have been the same as any airport coffee, but he tasted it beside the memory of the lodge window, the still lake, and the river audible through the glass. In the bookshop, he bought a field guide to Alaskan wildlife, the sort of book he might have thought to buy before he went out. He opened it to the brown bear section, while still standing among the shelves. The facts were useful. The photographs were good. But they could not give him the sound of the river, or the cold of frost on a railing, or the way a cub sat down in the shallows after missing a fish. This was no failure of the book. It was simply the truth of having been there. Anchorage felt like a hinge between worlds. On the way out, it had been the beginning of wildness. On the way back, it was the first return of the ordinary. The same airport, the same mountains beyond the glass, the same travelers with their duffel bags, camera cases, work jackets, and quiet, private reasons for moving through Alaska. Only the direction had changed, and with it, the meaning of everything. At the gate for the long flight towards London, Edward found the atmosphere quieter than he remembered, though perhaps the quiet was in himself. The aircraft was an anonymous long-haul jet, with narrow seats, small windows, recycled air, and the subdued patience of people preparing to sleep above the ocean. The route would carry him back in reverse. Alaska falling away, then ocean, then northern light over cloud and ice, then the gray morning of home. On takeoff, anchorage dropped beneath the wing. The inlet widened, the mountains receded, and for a few minutes Alaska lay below in vast, dark folds of forest, water, tundra, and river. Then cloud covered it gently, not abruptly, and the land was gone. The flight home was not shorter than the flight out, but it held a different kind of time. The outward journey had been full of anticipation, the mind running ahead towards bears, rivers, cabins, and unknown mornings. The return journey was filled with what had already happened. Edward sat by the window as the light over the North Atlantic lengthened into a low, golden twilight, and his mind moved back through the week with the slow selectiveness of memory. He thought of the large male at the lip of the falls, catching a salmon in a moment of complete precision. He thought of the mother bear making one small adjustment of position, placing herself between her cubs and a larger presence, without drama, without haste. He thought of the subadult male watching from the bank, learning patience from the river and from bears older than himself. He thought of the spent salmon near his feet, holding its place in the current with the last of its strength. The meal tray arrived with its small compartments, its sealed cup of water, its yogurt, its ordinary food made stranger by altitude and night. He ate because he was hungry, in a plain, grounded way. The hunger of someone who had been cold, outside, and attentive for several days. Later, when the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers slept, the plane became a narrow tube of blue light moving through darkness. Screens glowed softly. Blankets shifted. Somewhere, a child murmured and settled again. Edward did not quite sleep at first. He closed his eyes and found that he could still hear the river. Not with his ears, of course, but with the part of the mind where repeated sounds take root. Water over gravel. Water around stone. Water carrying itself onwards without hurry. The sound had become available to him, as certain places do after one has listened long enough. Morning over the British Isles was grey and soft. Through breaks in the cloud, he saw fields, roads, towns, and the familiar density of human habitation after the great open reaches of Alaska. London spread beneath the descent, intricate and immense, the Thames winding through it like a memory of water in another form. The aircraft touched down with a bump and a long rushing sound. Phones came on. Overhead lockers opened. Voices rose gently into the practical noise of arrival. Edward remained seated for a moment, while others stood. Outside the window were tarmac, service vehicles, airport buildings, and a low English sky. The ordinary world had returned. He looked at it quietly and thought of the river. He could still hear it. The taxi journey home followed the outward journey in reverse. Motorway, familiar roads, streets becoming narrower and more known. It was early, and amber streetlights still glowed in places where morning had not fully arrived. The trees along the road had turned while he was away. Leaves lay in damp drifts against the curbs. Autumn had been arriving at home, too, quietly doing its work while he watched it deepen beside the Brooks River. There is a particular strangeness in returning to a familiar place after a meaningful absence. Everything is as it was, and yet, for a little while, everything looks newly made. The house stood where it had always stood. The key turned with the same small resistance in the lock. When the door opened, the smell of the house met him. Cool, still, faintly closed, holding the accumulated quiet of empty rooms. The lamp on the timer had continued its modest duty. The house had not been lonely. It had simply waited. He set the suitcase in the hallway, where it looked both familiar and altered. The same suitcase that had stood there a week earlier, packed and ready, now carrying in its fabric and creases a trace of spruce, lake air, and cold morning. He turned up the thermostat, filled the kettle, and moved through the small rituals of return. Each action was ordinary. Each action was welcome. In the kitchen, he made tea in the usual mug. The kettle sounded loud in the quiet room. There were no ravens outside, no boardwalk beneath his feet, no river beyond the window. In the garden, leaves had begun to gather along the border, and a blackbird moved across the lawn with small, precise steps. It found something in the grass, tilted its head, and moved on. The ordinary English morning was going about its business. Edward sat at the kitchen table and opened his notebook. He did not edit or organize. He simply read. Spiderwebs in the mist. A dipper on a rock. The subadult male watching from the bank. The older couple on driftwood. The spent salmon near his feet. The river through the cabin window. The final entry had been written quickly that morning, before the float plane arrived. Frost on the boardwalk. Mirror Flat Lake. Bear track on the beach. River still running. He closed the notebook and set it beside his tea. A moment later, reaching into his coat pocket, he found the folded paper from the older couple. The bear's number was written in neat handwriting. He smoothed the paper on the table, looked at it for a while, and then pinned it to the kitchen notice board, among shopping lists, appointment reminders, and postcards. There it was, a small, quiet bridge between the river and the room, between wild Alaska and the domestic morning. By evening, the house was warm again. The suitcase had been partly unpacked. He had eaten something simple and familiar. The tiredness of the journey had settled into his body, not sharply, but deeply, as though all the miles and time zones had become weight at last. He sat in his usual chair in the room he knew best. The objects around him were unchanged. The street outside made its usual low sounds. The ordinary world was fully restored. And yet something was different. Not the room. The room was as it had been. The difference was in Edward, in the habit of attention he had brought back with him. He noticed the rain beginning outside, the first soft touches on the window, then the steadier sound on pavement and leaves. He noticed the smell of rain entering through a narrow opening in the window. He noticed the light in the room changing as cloud thickened overhead. He had spent a week paying attention to weather, and the habit had not yet left him. He closed his eyes. The river was there in memory, steady and clear. It was not an imagined drama, not a vision, only the remembered sound of water moving over gravel. He had listened to it for a week, and now it seemed to have found a place beneath thought, somewhere quiet and available. The bears came back gently. The large male at the falls, the young female in the shallows, the mother with her cubs along the far bank, the subadult male watching and waiting. Each one was distinct. Each one had been known only briefly, and yet known enough to remain. The salmon came too, dark shapes in clear water, pushing upstream with the last of their strength. One spent fish holding its place near his feet in the cold current. The ravens were in the spruce. The eagle crossed the lake. The mountains held their reflections in still water. What the week had given him was not knowledge only, though he had learned many things. It was not adventure only, though he had traveled far and stood beside a wild river in autumn. It was quieter than either. It was a recalibration, a reminder that the world is larger, older, and more patient than daily life often allows one to remember. There are places where salmon return, bears feed, frost gathers, rivers run, and human schedules mean very little. To be present in such a place, even briefly, changes the attention one brings home. Right then, as Edward sat in his chair with rain on the window, the Brooks River was still running from Brooks Lake to Naknek Lake. The bears were moving towards their dens, or lingering at the river for the last fish of the season. The ravens were in the spruce trees. The older couple might be at their usual table, drinking coffee and checking the notice board. The ranger might be making notes. The camp was going about its evening, as it would continue to do without him. The river did not need to be remembered, but he would remember it. He would remember it when he heard rain, or a stream under a bridge, or water running over stones in some small place far from Alaska. He would remember the smell of it in the morning air, the sound of it through cabin glass, the cold of it on his hand on the last morning. Outside, the rain settled into an even rhythm. Inside, the room grew softer around him. His tiredness deepened. His body became heavy in the chair. Thoughts loosened their edges and drifted. Somewhere far away, bears moved through the dark Alaskan forest towards their winter sleep. Salmon completed their cycle in the cold water of the Brooks River. Ravens waited in the spruce trees for morning, and the river ran steadily in memory, carrying cold, carrying light, carrying everything gently onward. Edward was home. The rain was on the window. The room was warm. The river was still running. And at last, peacefully and completely, he was ready for sleep.